Dear friends, we welcome you to this afternoon plenary session, Leaving No One Behind, Care for the Most Vulnerable. Amigos, sejam bem-vindos para a sessão plenária desta quarta-feira à tarde, com o tema Não Deixar Ninguém para Trás, cuidando dos mais vulneráveis. We are honored to have as our moderator, Bunny Dugal, Principal Representative to the United Nations, Baha'i International Community also. Nós temos a honra de ter conosco, moderando este painel, a representante das Nações Unidas e também da comunidade Baha'i, da comunidade internacional Baha'i. E ela fará a apresentação, então, dos nossos painelistas. And she will present our panelists for this afternoon. Thank you again. We hope you have a delightful plenary session.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I know the session after lunchtime is hard because we are full and getting a little sleepy. So we hope we are going to wake you up and discuss some difficult subjects. The promise to leave no one behind is all too often seen as hollow rhetoric, but it is central to religious teachings. This plenary will highlight both ongoing work and challenges for 4 critical communities that with members, where members fall among the most vulnerable. That's children, refugees, others forced to migrate, and minority religious communities. It will also reflect the challenges facing human trafficking as a global scourge. So these are some very tough issues that our humanity today is grappling with. And yet we are blessed to have faith communities and particularly active members of faith communities or organizations that are inspired from their faith tradition to try and make a difference. I'm accompanied here by 7 amazing individuals. I'm going to pass the mic to each of them to introduce themselves and to just frame in 30 seconds the issue that they will be speaking to. And then we'll come back and they'll give their introductory remarks. I'll ask them some questions, and then we'll open it up for hopefully a lively discussion. And I'd like everyone to remember that the purpose of the Interfaith 20 is that we can come up with some real recommendations that we can share with the member states, that the governments that will be meeting at the G20. So I ask my panelists and I ask the audience as well that when we are discussing it, let's think of real concrete recommendations that can be posed to the governments. So I have the pleasure of handing the mic first to Sharon Eubank.
Hello, I'm so happy to be with you. My name is Sharon Eubank. I'm the Director of Humanitarian Services for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And the focus today will be how to transition from emergency care to the sustainable solutions for the most vulnerable population. Our priority is children 0 to 5 and their parents.
Thank you. My name's Kevin Highland, and I'm from Ireland, although I worked all my life in the UK. I'm a former police officer from the UK and the first anti-slavery commissioner appointed by the British government. I was then Ireland's Council of Europe representative for human trafficking. And I'm going to speak today about the way that faith and perhaps crime, particularly when we're looking at human trafficking, intersect, and where we have, as faith leaders and people of faith, a role to influence the outcomes of those who are victims of crime, but also those who are perpetrators.
My name is Mustafa Yusuf Ali. I'm the Secretary General of the Global Network of Religions for Children and Director of Arigato International, Nairobi. I'm going to be speaking about children, and I am going to be sharing with you how states have failed children and are leaving many children behind, increasingly, especially in the last 2-3 years. Thank you.
I'm Nelson Ernst Neumann. I'm here from Brazil, Pastoral da Criança, it's Child's Pastorate, and I will focus on our paper as religious community, not only individual, not only to put pressure on government, but what we can do in our communities for others.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Isabella. I work for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. I'm currently working in the office here in Brasilia, and I'll be talking about refugees and what can we do as a society, what governments can do to make sure that refugees are not left behind.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. My name is Ibrahim Rasool. I'm from Cape Town, South Africa. I'm the founder of the World for All Foundation. And in my offering today, it would really be the areas of vulnerability that we find abundant in the world, the crises that produce them, and the fundamental provocation, whether faith communities would constitute being the doctor or the patient, or both.
Ok. Bom, boa tarde a todas as pessoas presentes. Bruno Renato Teixeira, secretário nacional de Promoção e Defesa dos Direitos Humanos do Ministério dos Direitos Humanos e da Cidadania. Queria agradecer a oportunidade de fazer parte desta mesa, dar boas-vindas a todas as delegações que estão aqui no Brasil e dizer da nossa ação governamental, em nome do presidente Lula, em nome do ministro Silvio Almeida, tratar um pouco das iniciativas que o Brasil vem adotando na perspectiva da garantia de direitos, na promoção dos direitos e na proteção dos direitos humanos. Então, é um momento de muita alegria para nós poder interagir com essa mesa para a gente pensar na interação das ações e das políticas de cuidar das pessoas. Então, é com esse intuito que a gente se faz presente e pretendemos fazer um bom debate. Muito obrigado.
Bruno, may I ask you to begin to share your remarks and then we'll take it from there. Thank you. You have the mic.
Alô? Ok. Bom, mais uma vez, como eu disse, saudar essa mesa, saudar todos os representantes aqui do IF, dizer do compromisso do Estado brasileiro com a pauta. É importante que o Brasil, enquanto país da América do Sul, se apresente para o conjunto das organizações internacionais, da sociedade civil internacional, promovendo um debate em torno do que para a gente tem sido muito caro, que é retirar o Brasil do mapa da fome, garantir que brasileiros e brasileiras possam se alimentar adequadamente como princípio, como algo primário na execução e no pensar numa política pública de cuidados. Não só o Brasil, mas outros países do mundo ainda vivem contextos de fome e que nós, a partir das iniciativas já exitosas do Estado brasileiro, podemos apresentar à comunidade internacional alternativas para a superação da miséria e da pobreza. É com esse objetivo que a gente traz algumas iniciativas, como a adoção de uma política capaz de garantir segurança alimentar à população, como eu tenho dito, como uma política elementar para se manter vivo e que, para a partir dela, nós possamos pensar em outros graus de cidadania. E quando eu falo na elevação da cidadania, é pensar numa política de cuidados, principalmente aos mais vulneráveis, que nós possamos articular iniciativas que deem conta de olhar para esse contexto das vulnerabilidades e pensar em forma de superar. Nesse contexto, nós temos plena convicção que a superação desses cenários de vulnerabilidade e de pobreza serão necessariamente garantidos a partir de uma forte intervenção estatal, mas, sobretudo, o olhar e a participação da sociedade civil organizada. E, nesse contexto, as instituições religiosas têm um papel fundamental, porque optam, em sua matriz ideológica, em estar perto das pessoas, em prestar o cuidado às pessoas. Então, ter uma política de caráter universal, que a gente possa atender à expectativa da população, necessariamente passa para a implementação de uma política que observe as especificidades de cada território e de cada segmento vulnerável. O Brasil é resultado de um contexto histórico da formação de seu povo, que diz de um contexto de violência na sua formação, onde segregou direitos básicos e elementares de povos indígenas, dos migrantes forçados negros, né? O tráfico de pessoas, o tráfico transatlântico que permeou no Brasil durante muitos anos, refletem um contexto de graves violações de direitos humanos e que expôs um segmento importante da população a condições de extrema vulnerabilidade. Então, esse passivo histórico, nós, do governo do presidente Lula, temos assumido o compromisso de achar as respostas. E nós temos convicção que essas respostas que atingem ainda grupos vulneráveis virão com uma escuta qualificada também dos seus partícipes. Não há como se pensar uma política de forma centralizada que não valorize a possibilidade da escuta, da diversidade do seu povo. E é nesse sentido que nós temos construído as políticas, observando a diversidade regional, observando as diversidades enquanto pessoas, né? Atender os grupos vulneráveis significa pensar numa política não só de assistência, mas, sobretudo, de elevação da cidadania, passa por olhar para as crianças, para os idosos, para as pessoas com deficiência, né, para a população em situação de rua. Infelizmente, o Brasil e o mundo vivem um contexto onde há uma crescente, uma escalada de pessoas vivendo nas ruas, né, e fragilizando o direito dos migrantes, sobretudo, né, dos refugiados, apátridas, se encontram nesse contexto de ausência de direitos. Então, pensar numa política de direitos humanos passa necessariamente por pensar numa política de cuidados que coloquem seres humanos numa condição elevada de cidadania. E, para isso, iniciativas como Fome Zero, como Bolsa Família, como programas de emprego e renda, programas que visam, né, garantir o acesso primário da população a direitos mínimos, tem sido uma tarefa desafiadora para o Brasil, mas essa metodologia que é exitosa, que já retirou milhares e milhões de pessoas do mapa da fome, o Brasil entende que pode contribuir para o cenário mundial com valorosas contribuições no que diz respeito aos métodos que tem utilizado, entendendo que retirar as pessoas da pobreza, garantir um grau elevado de educação, preservar os direitos humanos das pessoas, garantir que nós tenhamos uma política que promova a diversidade religiosa, que enfrente o racismo religioso e a intolerância, são condições que o Brasil pode contribuir nesse debate global para que a gente possa garantir direitos humanos para todos e todas. Espero que nesses rápidos 5 minutos eu tenha falado um pouquinho dos contextos do cenário nacional e que a gente está aqui à disposição para fazer o debate. Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Bruno. You have outlined an ideal scenario of how a government should be thinking about addressing the needs of the most vulnerable. And maybe we'll come back and revisit that from the point of view of some of our speakers. Sharon, the Latter-day Saints charities are known for their humanitarian work. So share with us your experience.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your comments representing the government. I thought I would begin by telling a story. Around my office building, there are people who beg for money. And on one of the entrances, there is a woman who, she does not just sit with a cardboard sign or gently ask people for money. As you cross the street, she jumps out and walks with you and sits right in your face and says, please, please help me, I need help. And she's very assertive. And I'm afraid of her. And so I stopped going into that entrance. I would go around the other side so that I would not encounter her. But one day I was walking with my colleague Elizabeth, and as we were in the crosswalk, that woman came and she accosted us. And my colleague said, "Oh, Evelyn, it's so nice to see you." And she put her arm around her. She said, "How are you doing?" And Evelyn said, "Oh, it's a good day because I saw my 2 children who are high school students. I saw them walking to school, and so I got to greet them." And as she was leaving, Elizabeth put her arm around this Evelyn, and she gave her a hug. And I saw Evelyn's face. She closed her eyes and kind of leaned into that hug. And I recognized she doesn't have many opportunities for a safe kind of human contact. And I said to Elizabeth when we walked away, "How do you know her?" And she knew her the same way I did. She met her on the street, but she shared her lunch. When she brought her children down to look at the Christmas lights, she introduced them to Evelyn. Evelyn gave the girls a little snack cake that she had received from someplace as a Christmas present. She exchanged that. And she told them that her greatest goal was to save up enough money that she could buy a bus ticket to Chattanooga, Tennessee. And they said, "Why do you want to go to Chattanooga?" And she said, "It's the name, Chattanooga. It sounds like poetry." That was her great desire. Jesus gave a parable about people like me who walk around to the other side of the building when they see somebody in need, and I am not proud of the way that I responded to her. And I am proud of the way that Elizabeth did respond. There is a great lesson in that parable that Jesus gave, that when the Samaritan went to that traveler's need, and when the traveler established a relationship with him, there was an exchange of dignity and richness that I forfeited because I was not willing to engage with Evelyn or even know her name. That parable was given right when somebody asked Jesus, he said, the 2 great commandments are to love God with all of our heart, might, mind, and strength, and to love other people as if we had the same energy as the way we love ourselves. And on this 2 principles hang all the other laws. But there was a lawyer in the audience who said, quibbling, "Well, what's the definition of neighbor?" And then he gave that parable. I worry when we talk about leaving no one behind and caring for the most vulnerable, that we inadvertently come to it as I am rich, I am wealthy, I am educated, and I know things, and I am here to help you. And I'm afraid that we don't ever take the time, the way my colleague did with Elizabeth, to sit down and ask the people, engage with them. What is it you want? What is the dream that you have? And that whatever path they're following, our path will be found in helping them reach theirs. The truth of this is we are all interconnected. My faith teaches there are 2 paths. The one path is we manage according to we prosper according to the management of our creature. It's pretty much, the law, I will get by taking care of myself, the law of the fittest. The other path, which is not evolutionarily intuitive to us, is that I prosper according to the way that I help my neighbor and help their interest. It's not intuitive, but it is the long-term progress for all of humankind. The reason I bring this up in terms of this is that faith communities have tremendous reach. We know the Evelyns, we know who they are, we know where they are, we know their names because of our grassroots presence. We have tremendous scope. We've been teaching the moral imperative that we must love God by loving each other in the family for millennia. And the third thing is we have tremendous scale. When we come to a forum like this and we engage with each other and we stand up for each other and we promote and cooperate with each other's work, there is nothing on this planet that can stop that kind of movement. Not a national government, not any other movement, because there's so much power in it. So in that service, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has 4 commitments. The first commitment is that we will not be extractive in our relationships with nature or with other people. We are not going to impose our will and hope that they're polite enough to be beggars in the way that we think they should be beggars. The second thing is that we will connect faith actors to government and government to faith actors in any possible way we can, because we know that there is productive relationships in that. And part of the work going on at the G20 Interfaith Forum is just about that, so that we can build that bridge between policymakers and the faith community. The third commitment is that we don't want to be beholden to that the agenda is set by people who have money and power. And we want to bring our own money, our own assets, our own human capital, our own expertise into the equation, because the powerful voice that we can raise is the most powerful thing that we can add to this agenda. And to be realistic, we're going to have to come up with the ways that we can bring finance to the equation. And I'm interested in some of the creative opportunities. The final thing is that we have made a commitment that we cannot do this on our own. We just recognize on our own we can get to a certain level. So our commitment is to fund coalitions. It's why we're active here. It's why we want to bring groups together who have given evidence that they can help the most vulnerable and fund those coalitions. I'm committed to that. I'm committed to the work of this panel and for the greater work of the G20 Interfaith Forum. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sharon. You have completely inspired me, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion. And maybe we'll talk about the 4 principles as we move along. Kevin.
Thank you. And as a former police officer and member of the military, and then as a representative of the British government in an independent role, some people might say, where does faith play a role within that? And I think that faith is crucial and a real part of everyday society. And Pope Francis has said that we should fix our gaze on heaven and to be aware that no one should be left behind in the pilgrimage on earth. And he makes it clear that we are the temporary incumbents of this world. And the way that we treat this world and how we treat each other will be how future generations behave, but also how they view us. So it's so important that we understand where the opportunities are, and as Sharon said, how we work collectively together. But our world has, as we know, suffered quite significantly recently. 28 conflicts around the world. People wanting to kill each other for some reason. And as a police officer, going back perhaps 35 years ago, working in London, I saw people being attacked. I worked in an area that was a very high population of the Jewish community, who may be subject of anti-Semitic attacks. But then we had Muslims who were attacked because they were Muslim. And me as a Catholic, at that time, the Catholic community was being blamed for the problems in Northern Ireland with bombings. So faith was being blamed for things that were actually really criminal acts. And how can we really start to understand that? How can we as faith people and as people in professions start to work towards that? Well, in a way, we need to look at ourselves. Exemplo ducamus, lead by example. My loss and my suffering can never be more than your loss or your suffering. The death of one child isn't greater because they're my child than the next person's child. Of course, I might feel it different. I will feel it personally. But just because someone is a different race, different colour, different background, Why should we treat them different? And in the UK, for example, anti-Semitism and anti-Islamic phobia and the left and the right ended up in riots recently. And the riots held a mosque to siege, and the Bayan mob wanted to break into the mosque, and there were fights with police, and police officers were injured, and the mosque protected itself with the police. And then the imam spoke on the TV, and he said, I don't blame the community. I don't blame anybody. And the next morning, people of all faiths and people of goodwill came together with brushes and shovels and cleaned the community up. But then the media, perhaps not what the media normally do, they brought the person who organised the riots or the disturbance and the imam together. And they interviewed them. And they gave their points. And at the end of that interview, they stood up and hugged each other and said, our communities need to work together. People who were divided by hatred were now coming together in what really was a showing of love. So when I was a police officer and planning for the Olympics as the lead for human trafficking, who were my allies going to be? And so I started working with religious sisters and the church and different faiths so that we could then reach into communities. We could provide services to the vulnerable. We were looking on a practical way of leaving nobody behind. And of course, that led to a really big relationship being formed between law enforcement, which was then told to Pope Benedict and Pope Francis, who then held meetings, or Pope Francis did, where he brought police chiefs, people from justice, people from governments, and bishops and religious sisters from around the world to the Vatican, and formed the Santa Marta Group, which works on bringing those relationships together to leave nobody behind. People who come from all different parts of the world. So that was an eye-opener for me, how the police, how the state, how governments can benefit from relationships. And to give you an example of a benefit that happened, a very practical benefit, was I was prosecuting a case at the Old Bailey, the most senior court in the UK, of human trafficking. And we were missing a witness. And of course, the defense were really happy, because without that witness, the case was going to collapse. And we believed the witness had gone back to Nigeria. So a phone call to a religious sister resulted in her finding that witness in 2 or 3 hours. And because we were able to say that person was coming back, the perpetrators pleaded guilty. And the victims got all the support, got compensation, but that was all because of a relationship with one religious sister in Nigeria. So the session I'm doing this afternoon will be on human trafficking. And what I'm calling for with the Interfaith Alliance is that we ask and call on the G20 to invest 30 billion by 2030 alongside the SDGs in the fight against human trafficking to build infrastructures that counter this crime that currently has 50 million people around the world suffering and generates $236 billion every year in illicit gain. And that's what I see as a practical thing that we can bring, working with governments, but with the leadership of faith of all types, using our moral compass pointing in the right direction. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Kevin. And thank you also for making that concrete recommendation. We move on to Mustafa.
Thank you, Bani. Good afternoon once again. I promised that I'll speak on children and in this session of leaving no one behind. And when I was invited to speak in this plenary, I was asked to also talk about what is it that we are doing or are going to do to ensure that what we are saying is what we are going to be doing? So I'll be speaking about children and also what we are going to be doing in Abu Dhabi in November 2024 during our 6th Forum of the Global Network of Religions for Children. And we are here, the Interfaith Forum for the G20 is primarily brings together people of faith, faith leaders. Because we are here in Brazil, a deeply religious, spiritual country, I'm going to quote from the Bible this afternoon. And something that is written that you are the salt of the earth and the light of the world. But what happens when you lose that saltiness and the light starts dimming? If a salt loses its saltiness, then it's useless, isn't it? And when the light dims and stops shining, it's pointless to carry a torch of that light, isn't it? Now, faith leaders are supposed to continue being the salt of the earth and the light of the world. When you lose that saltiness and you're dimming that light, then you're not going to be helpful to the community. And this is why today, questions are being asked about what you, as faith communities, religious leaders, are doing to care for children. And if I may turn to just some statistics here, you look at this year in 2024, the global context of children. 460 million children are now living in conflict zones. 1 in 5 face extreme violence. 50.2 million children are displaced. These are children as refugees or internally displaced children. 10 million alone, 10 million in 2023 alone were displaced. $1.4 billion still lack access to basic amenities. 333 million live in poverty. 150 million more children were pushed into multi-dimensional poverty at the onset of COVID, and 1 in 4 are facing starvation. Are we speaking enough for these children? Are we? Are we speaking enough for these children? I don't think so. So when we have 460 million children living in conflict zones, then we have failed. And who is producing these conflicts today? And if you read carefully and do an analysis, you will find states are responsible for producing and creating most conflicts. A few, of course, are created by non-state actors. And therefore, in the G20 summit that is going to come to Brazil, if we are going to leave no child behind, then in that G20, we are going to speak about these 460 million children that are still living in conflict zone. It does not matter whether this child lives in New York or in Tel Aviv, in Gaza, in Nairobi, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Kinshasa, in Myanmar. A child needs protection, and we are leaving them behind. Children don't understand why we fight and what we fight for. Children are supposed to be protected. Children are protected by international conventions, the Rome Statutes, Geneva Conventions, the laws governing wars, the CRC. But what do states do when we start speaking about these very conventions that are supposed to be protecting children, that are passed and ratified by states themselves? Then we see some kind of double standards. And you and I know that in the last year, we've been seeing many cases of double standards and hypocrisy. But what are religious leaders supposed to be doing? Are we supposed to keep quiet? Then we lose the saltiness. And when that saltiness is no longer going to be there, then you're going to be worthless. before the states, before your communities, and therefore we have to work a lot harder. So the Global Network of Religions for Children is going to be hosting the 6th forum in Abu Dhabi later this year. And this particular forum is going to be hosted by the Interfaith Alliance for Safer Communities, where we are going to be discussing these issues, and we will come up with a plan of action, a call to action, and an Abu Dhabi declaration that we are going to be, we are going to declare, we are going to use for the next 6 years until 2030. The theme of the forum is going to be "The Child is Calling." Why the child is calling? Because children are calling us. Children are calling you to not to dim your lights, to not lose your saltiness. Let's speak for children. They're not part of our political conflicts anywhere in the world. And we are going to be focusing on interfaith cooperation to build a hopeful world for children. And I take this opportunity to welcome all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mustafa, and for those grim statistics, which I think we needed to revisit as we're having this discussion. Nelson, you had said in your opening that you're going to talk about what we can do. So I think that's a really welcome break from hearing some of the suffering. And so we turn to you now.
Thank you very much. I will speak in Portuguese. Boa tarde a todos. Como pastoral da criança, no Brasil a gente trabalha em mais de 2.000 municípios, e também em Peru, Bolívia, Guiné-Bissau, Moçambique, na África. Mas eu gostaria de centrar em um caso específico, um município chamado Chapecó, no sul do Brasil, que recebeu 11.000 haitianos e 9.000 venezuelanos. E aconteceu de uma gestante haitiana, que não falava nada de português nem francês, se sentir mal e ir para uma unidade básica de saúde. Teve convulsão, entrou em coma, foi levada para a maternidade. 1 dia e meio depois, ela descobriu que não tinha mais nada no ventre. Levou 1 dia e meio para descobrir que a criança estava na UTI, porque nasceu prematura, mas depois estava bem o suficiente para voltar com a mãe. E, ao mesmo tempo, a equipe de enfermagem e de medicina falando assim para o bebê, para a mãe, baby, para mamar. E a gente fica puxando. Como é que isso pode acontecer em uma comunidade, em uma diocese rica, de alguém não saber, não ter essa infraestrutura? Aí a gente começou a trabalhar com a Associação dos Haitianos, e dizer assim, olha, puxa, como é que funciona a busca por esse serviço de saúde? E percebeu, por exemplo, que no pré-natal, quando você faz a unidade básica de saúde, quem ia conversar, traduzir, era alguém contratado, não era o marido, e o médico conversava como se fosse, e ele constrangido quando descobriu que a esposa tinha sífilis e estava conversando com um estranho sobre o que poderia acontecer. E a gente começou a ver o que a comunidade podia fazer, porque a comunidade, eu não conheço os haitianos, ouvi falar que eles são violentos, e a gente começa a dizer assim, olha, eu estive no Haiti e vi lá que eles usam ainda a tal da palmatória. A criança errou a tabuada, recebe um tapa na mão. Então, é o Estado ensinando esse tipo de prática, então vem com essa cultura. E no momento que a gente faz, eu vou tentar convencer vocês a não seguir a lei, o que acontece? No Brasil, teve um tipo de comportamento como esse, você pode pôr na cadeia. E começou, naquele estado de Santa Catarina, tirar as crianças venezuelanas e haitianas das suas famílias. Por quê? Porque a criança tinha sofrido violência, porque a criança estava desnutrida, porque a criança não ia para a escola. E nós, como espaço religioso, temos a liberdade, ao menos no Brasil, de agir com misericórdia antes de aplicar a lei. Quer dizer, como é que eu posso explicar para a comunidade que está no entorno, vamos ajudar essa família, compreender que vem de uma cultura diferente, que existe uma outra maneira de lidar com essa violência e não simplesmente retirar a criança da família. Em um outro caso, uma gestante venezuelana, 22 anos, teve um derrame.
um AVC, estava paralisada saindo de casa quando o nosso grupo encontrou, ajudou a levar para o serviço de saúde, porque não sabiam a que serviço recorrer. Ela ficou internada e depois teve o que a gente chama alta a pedido. Antes de ter sarado, ela pediu para voltar para casa porque não tinha ninguém para cuidar da criança de 6 anos. E o marido precisava trabalhar, se não tinha como comer. E a comunidade, quando a gente conseguiu quebrar esse apartheid entre os brasileiros e os estranhos que vêm de fora, em grande número, o que a gente viu? Puxa, o que pode ser feito? Ela tinha uma consulta, depois de um tempo, para neurologia, perdeu a consulta porque não tinha passagem de ônibus. Mas a prefeitura tem um sistema de transporte para quem tem dificuldade de locomoção. Então alguém falou, eu aciono a prefeitura para vir buscar, eu aciono alguém para ficar com essas crianças, eu sei que vocês estão passando fome, tem instituições que conseguem a bolsa, eu trabalho na escola, vou conseguir a matrícula para sua criança de 6 anos. Uma outra se prontificou, eu sou fisioterapeuta, eu consigo ajudar ela como indivíduo. Então a gente começa a ver, por exemplo, se eu não preparo as nossas comunidades, e ali foi comunidade, católicos sim, evangélicos também, e outros trabalhando em conjunto e percebendo o quanto podiam fazer para não ter simplesmente crianças desnutridas e tal. E quando a gente fica pensando o porquê, como é que uma menina de 22 anos chega a ter AVC aqui no Brasil? Daí vai conversar com ela e descobre, não precisa contar o que está acontecendo lá na Venezuela. Com toda a situação para chegar em Roraima, no Brasil, para conseguir o documento, ficou 10 dias na praça, porque ninguém sabia quando o documento ia chegar e a qualquer momento alguém podia avisar. Até conseguir chegar no Estado, conseguir o emprego. Então, essa situação, nem os médicos mesmos conseguiam elaborar. Em São Paulo, maior cidade do país, tivemos 6 casos de mortes maternas de haitianas, num índice muito acima do Brasil de morte materna, que passaram 2 vezes pelo serviço de saúde, inclusive hospital, antes de morrer. E desses 6 casos, 4, os médicos não conseguiam identificar porque eram causas tão difíceis, tão pela desnutrição, pelas coisas que estavam lá, que a gente precisa ver, eu preciso agir antes. Então, hoje de manhã foi falado aqui nessa plenária, muito importante, individualmente a gente pode ajudar. Como grupo, a gente tem como pressionar o governo, mas tem coisas que a gente pode fazer em cada uma das nossas igrejas, em cada uma das nossas comunidades, né? Por quê? Porque esse acolhimento, esse entendimento do estrangeiro é possível para todos. Em inglês, isso não fica tão bacana, mas existe uma passagem, né, na Bíblia que Jesus fala do samaritano, de alguém que foi espancado, e apareceu alguém que não era nem padre, nem catequista, era alguém de outra religião e começou a ajudar. E, na palavra em português, quem fez bem fez misericórdia. Tratou o miserável com o coração. Mas a palavra que Jesus usou, em aramaico, ramin, que quer dizer útero. E a gente vê que o que aquele samaritano fez, olhou, cuidou, pôs na montaria, tratou as feridas, levou é muito mais do que o coração faz. Porque o coração bate e bate por toda a vida. Mas só faz uma coisa, joga sangue. Se nós agirmos como útero, que foi o chamado que Jesus nos fez, o útero protege, o útero leva o sangue, o útero purifica a criança, joga o excremento fora, aquece, faz como esse samaritano fez, mas tem uma questão, por 9 meses. Se depois que a criança nasce, a mãe vai dizer assim, eu vou respirar por você. Não tem como. A comida não vai chegar pelo cordão umbilical. Você vai ter que fazer o teu esforço. A criança vai suar mamando, né? Eu vou chegar perto, eu vou ajudar, mas a gente tem que fazer o nosso dever como religiosos, é que essas pessoas, essas crianças, comecem a caminhar por suas próprias forças. Obrigado.
Thank you very much. And I think the UN High Commissioner for Refugees office is doing really, really difficult work all over the world. And Isabella, you're going to share with us some of those experiences.
Yes.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. I will also switch to Portuguese. O Acnur, a Agência da ONU para Refugiados, tem um mandato muito específico com relação à mobilidade humana, que é dar proteção e buscar soluções duradouras para as pessoas refugiadas. E a gente está entendendo aqui, como pessoas refugiadas, aquelas que são forçadas a se deslocar. E foi falado aqui já por várias das pessoas que me antecederam desse drama humano, que é ter que deixar seu país de origem por conflito, por guerra, por perseguição, muitas vezes religiosa, política, por raça. E é nessa realidade que a gente atua no mundo inteiro. Eu trabalho especificamente aqui no escritório do Brasil, e o meu antecessor aqui acabou de dar um exemplo lindo de como as comunidades religiosas aqui no Brasil têm feito um trabalho excepcional em ajudar, em prover essa integração para os refugiados. É bem importante a gente entender um pouco hoje em dia qual que é o contexto desse deslocamento forçado. Todo ano, o Acnur lança um relatório global para introduzir um pouco qual é a realidade do deslocamento forçado no mundo. E esse ano, no dia 20 de junho, que é o Dia Mundial do Refugiado, esse relatório foi publicado mais uma vez, com essa compilação dos dados, e é o 12º ano seguido que esse relatório apresenta números crescentes com relação ao deslocamento forçado. Só aí já dá para sentir um pouco o drama da complexidade dessa situação, e que a gente vai vendo que, devido a conflitos novos, conflitos que não terminam, conflitos que se agravam, situações em vários países do mundo têm gerado esse aumento do deslocamento. E aí são várias questões, a gente vê Afeganistão, Congo, a própria Venezuela, são inúmeras situações que todos nós estamos vendo todo dia, e uma das consequências desses conflitos e da não chegada a uma estabilização é o deslocamento forçado dessas pessoas. Então, no final de 2023, existiam 117 milhões de pessoas nessa situação, deslocadas de maneira forçada. Dentro desse número, a gente está incluindo tanto pessoas que estão deslocadas internamente, mas também os refugiados e as pessoas apátridas, que ficaram sem nenhuma nacionalidade. É impressionante o número de pessoas dentro desse número que são crianças e também mulheres. E aí tem todo esse desafio também de, muitas vezes, crianças se movendo sozinhas, separadas de suas famílias. Então, tudo isso faz parte um pouco desse cenário. 75% das pessoas que se deslocam no mundo hoje estão em países em desenvolvimento. Então, a grande maioria desses refugiados estão em países em desenvolvimento. E 69% delas ainda em sua região de origem. Então, a grande maioria dos refugiados, eles deixam o seu país de origem, mas terminam ficando ali na região próxima de onde elas se deixaram. Então, grande parte também da busca por soluções é cada vez mais compartilhar responsabilidades entre os vários estados que estão recebendo essas pessoas, os vários países que estão recebendo essas pessoas, e também buscar esse desafio em que muitas das comunidades, quando elas estão chegando, também enfrentam grandes dificuldades de pobreza, vulnerabilidade com as questões climáticas, integração dessas pessoas. Outro dado também que vale a pena a gente até relacionar com a fala de um dos predecessores é que, muitas vezes, essas pessoas acabam buscando essa proteção, buscando soluções para essa busca de deixar a situação de perseguição, optando por rotas, muitas vezes irregulares, que às vezes é a única maneira de fugir de uma situação de conflito, e acabam sendo vítimas de redes de contrabando e tráfico de pessoas, o que é outra realidade que coloca um desafio ainda maior nessa realidade dos deslocamentos forçados. O Acnur tem trabalhado no mundo inteiro em busca, então, de garantir que nenhum refugiado é deixado para trás. E como a gente faz isso? Tanto tentando coordenar com os governos de todo o mundo a manter os maiores padrões possíveis de respeito ao direito internacional dos refugiados. Então, garantir o direito à proteção internacional, acesso ao território, à documentação e à integração. E também um trabalho muito grande com toda a comunidade, como ficou muito claro aqui na fala do meu colega, de garantir que essas pessoas tenham uma efetiva reconstrução de suas vidas nesse país, nesse outro lugar onde elas chegaram. E isso passa por vários elementos, né? E a inclusão na comunidade local é uma parte muito importante disso. E eu acho que eu não preciso nem elaborar mais sobre o papel fundamental que as comunidades religiosas fazem com relação a isso, porque foi muito falado aqui. A gente vê que tanto na promoção da paz, prevenção em conflito, mas também nesse papel tradicional de oferecer um santuário de proteção para as pessoas refugiadas, o papel das comunidades religiosas é fundamental. Então, eu acho extremamente importante e agradeço muito a oportunidade desse tema estar sendo falado nesse evento hoje. Obrigada.
Thank you very much. And now we go on to Mr. Rasul. Ibrahim.
Thank you very much, moderator. I want to say that I, in 5 minutes, want to put forward 5 provocations. And I use the word provocation because I'm committed to the idea of leaving no one behind, but I fear that it is embedded in our systems and structures to leave people behind. And therefore, it can't be a nice conversation. It has to be a provocative conversation. And we need to interrogate whether religion and faith is the doctor or the patient or both. And so we are a generation of religious leaders who have inherited a unique set of intersecting crises. We all enjoy the mobility of capital and goods, but we often don't understand the unprecedented poverty and inequality that is in that economic crisis that has been created. We enjoy the technology and the innovation, but we don't always link it to the degradation of the planet and the natural world. We revel in the knowledge and the science that is there, but it also erodes the historic and traditional anchors that people have had in faith and in culture and in their own traditions. We, however, have an ambiguous relationship when people are mobile, where people too can choose to move, whether forced or whether seeking a better life. And when people exercise their mobility to move, we have seen the production of an unprecedented number of isms and phobias in the last while. We have created a phobia for every type of people or an ism for every prejudice we have, whether it is racism, misogyny, anti-Semitism, homophobia, Islamophobia, xenophobia, and every other ism and phobia you can think about. What has happened, and sometimes the religious world is complicit in it, we have now entered a frightening competition for victimhood. Who are the greatest victims of this crisis-ridden world that we are in? Because we are all victims. But when we compete for victimhood, we don't simply want to be the worst victim of life. We want to be the worst victim because that victimhood gives us a license for impunity and an avoidance of accountability. We want to say, we were the victims of such a genocide that we can do anything in the world today. We want to say that we were the victims of colonialism and therefore terror is licensed. And therefore, the question that I think we come to is whether faith is the doctor or whether it is the patient. Because faith has its own contradictions. And all morning we have praised ourselves that 80% of the world have a religious affiliation of some sort or the other. And yet, we have a world that is in deep crisis. Our orthodoxies are in inertia. It's bonded to the past. It understands the need to the future, to go to the future, but unable to move. And so we become apologists. We become apologists for terror. We become apologists, as we've heard, for genocide. We become apologists for Hindutva. We become apologists for gun violence. We become apologists for political populism. And we choose sides. And so, faith faces its own contradictions. And we who gather here as the middle ground between the orthodoxies in inertia and the extremes that are bent on nihilism, destruction of self and others. We, the middle ground, are often found ambiguous and fearful, tentative, boring and unimaginative, the victims of politics, rather than the agents of the new future that we look for. And so the question is, in a world where we claim to have 80% of people religiously bonded, what do we do in that world when 90% of countries have minorities of more than 10%? Do we learn a theology of embrace, a theology of accepting the stranger, a theology of diversity, or do we side with the populists and side with the xenophobes, the Islamophobes, the anti-Semitics, the misogynists, etc.? If 80% of people are bonded in religion, then what do we do in a world where 1 in 3 women find themselves in relationships of gender-based violence, where it's a reality for them because both the victim and the perpetrator must make a turn in the mosque, must make a turn in the church, must make a turn in the temple or any other place of worship, must read a scripture, and yet is impervious to our influence as we go forward. What do we do in a world where 117 million people are forcibly displaced? And I won't even speak about the children's figures that have been shown here. Victims of war, violence, and persecution. And so, how do we extend beyond charity to deal with those kind of things and get to the causes? In a world where 50 million people are engulfed in trafficking, some as forced labor, some as sex slaves, and some in forced marriages. What do we do? Because a lot of this is often done in complicity with us. And therefore, my fifth and last provocation is that I don't doubt that the faith and religious communities have moral clarity. We know what is right and wrong. I suspect we don't always have moral courage. The notion that Nelson Mandela taught us, that if you know what is right and you know what is wrong, follow it up with your moral courage so that you do the things and you don't tinker at the edges. And so, we have not in this generation, I grew up in a generation that was confronted by apartheid. And so moral courage was often forced on us. And so interfaith, in our case in South Africa, led by people like Desmond Tutu, Alan Busak, Imam Hassan, and others, moral courage for us was to transform our theologies. And hence was born and borrowed from across the world the liberation theology. The ability to confront dictators in Latin America, confront colonialists in Africa, confront your oppressors in the Asian worlds, and so forth. What is the modern form of liberation theology? If we don't have a theology for the pathologies that we confront, then we tinker at the edges. Then we bleed niceties, but we act with no real impact. And so the question is, as we locate ourselves on the sides and on the top of the G20, what do we carry into it? How do we change the structures? Of course, we must energize and reimagine our faiths so that we can have the modern, upgraded app of liberation theology. What is it? We must guide our flocks to live sustainably and embracingly. But we know that that's not enough, because that's not where the problem has been created. We must be able to heal our societies. But very importantly, and this is where the liberation theology comes in, we must have the moral courage to speak truth to power, to confront the systems, to confront the structures, and that's what we must try and do as we go to the next round of the G20. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for those provocations. Secretary Teixeira, thank you for staying as long as you can. I believe you may have to leave a little early, but thank you for the generosity of your time. It's really important for us to have your perspective from a government standpoint, and maybe if you'd like to respond to what you have heard here. But I'm going to, before that, I'm going to just pose a few questions. I think what I've picked up from some of the interventions that at the root cause, the rooted challenges testify to some structural issues that are ingrained in our societies, whether it's growing inequality, whether it's the extremes of wealth and poverty, whether it's rampant corruption that is preventing us to get out of this. Because we've heard from the speakers that we have the statistics, we have the map as to how to get out of these issues, and yet it's not happening. So what can, how might member states use policy tools to bring about conditions worthy of the highest aspirations of their people? And how can we, as civil society, as faith-based actors, build capacity in the grassroots, build strong, resilient communities that can rise up to meet the challenges that they're being faced? Because it seems like our structures are shaky and not being able to provide. So maybe we need to look to the grassroots and build that capacity there. So these are some questions that I've picked up from some of the interventions. Secretary Teixeira, if you'd like to respond to some of what you've heard. And of course, you're not responsible for all the governments in the world, but you are coming with that perspective. And then I'll ask the speakers to quickly share anything, and we'll open it up to the audience. Please.
Ok. Não, acho que é importante os pontos que foram trazidos para a discussão, porque são pontos que é também uma percepção nossa, que estamos no governo, de uma problemática global, né, que é o contexto das vulnerabilidades e múltiplas, né, que atingem a população, as guerras, o cenário de fome, a pobreza extrema, né, o avanço de um capitalismo que não olha para quem de fato precisa, né? Então, a nossa concepção enquanto governo e o que orienta a ação das nossas políticas é a superação não só desse contexto de pobreza, mas também a percepção de uma mudança necessária de uma cultura enquanto nação, enquanto soberania, né? Não há de se falar em Estado democrático de direito, né, como se constitui o Estado brasileiro, num país onde há pessoas em extrema vulnerabilidade. democracia é sinônimo de igualdade, de respeito, de cuidado, né, de um Estado que seja capaz de promover a cidadania. Então, o conceito de Estado democrático de direito, consolidado na nossa Constituição de 88, ele é um princípio a ser alcançado. Né? A gente não pode trabalhar como um princípio posto, né? Garantidor, porque a gente está construindo mecanismos para que a gente consiga, de fato, alcançar essa soberania, né? Alcançar, de fato, a consolidação da democracia no Brasil. E dialogando muito com o que o Dr. Mustafa trouxe para o debate, se nós não olharmos, e aí eu falo enquanto Estado brasileiro, para a garantia que é prevista também na nossa Constituição, da prioridade absoluta para os direitos de nossas crianças e adolescentes, né, nós teremos também essa democracia, essa Constituição não cumprida. Eu acho que o Estado tem o papel de indutor da política, fomentador por meio dos recursos, mas um Estado autoritário, ele é o Estado que não observa os movimentos da sociedade civil e não prestigia o diálogo permanente da sociedade civil, das comunidades religiosas, na construção de uma política que seja capaz de dar uma resposta efetiva a esse contexto. Eu acho que o primeiro ponto é nós reconhecermos que ainda estamos em débito com a humanidade, em débito contra o povo. Esse é o primeiro sentido, é a primeira percepção que nós, representantes dos governos, precisamos fazer, porque é só a partir da percepção e que assumamos publicamente que ainda há um passivo histórico a ser pago aos mais vulneráveis, resultado desse processo histórico dos medos, que o imperialismo, que o capitalismo, que o processo da evolução econômica da humanidade colocou esse segmento da população, nós não conseguiremos alterar, de fato, essa cultura. Então, para que a gente tenha uma cultura de soberania nacional, democracia e garantia de direitos, necessariamente esse pacto, essa concertação nos formatos que estão sendo, no formato que está sendo pensado no âmbito desta conferência, é que nós vamos conseguir sair com medidas efetivamente capazes de alterar o status quo que nós vivemos hoje no Brasil e no mundo. E aí a cooperação internacional, né, a escuta qualificada dos movimentos, principalmente daqueles que estão no território, e o Estado, na sua laicidade, na sua independência, deverá ter o papel de promover esses fóruns interreligiosos na perspectiva de colher aquilo que é de melhor dessa contribuição, que é a percepção do bem, que paira sobre todas as religiões e, sobretudo, a vocação de estar nos territórios, escutando e promovendo uma cultura de paz. É nesse sentido que cabe a nós, enquanto Estado brasileiro, organizar cenários que viabilize a construção coletiva dos saberes e, sobretudo, da aplicação do recurso público e privado. É nesse sentido que a gente agradece muito a possibilidade de olhar para esse contexto de um debate interreligioso. A exemplo do que o Brasil tem promovido, a gente espera que o conjunto dos países do G20, mas também as demais comunidades internacionais possam amadurecer, né, em torno de uma agenda de paz e numa agenda de promoção onde, ao final, nós não deixaremos ninguém para trás, porque hoje nós temos a certeza que há muitas pessoas ainda para trás e que nós precisamos colocar lado a lado, junto com todos e todas. Muito obrigado.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Would any of the panelists like to speak to the questions, or if you prefer, we could open it up to the audience? Kevin, excellent.
Thank you. On the issue of policy, when we're talking about, as I have and will be doing a session on human trafficking, we've had policy for a long time, right back to 1930 with the Forced Labour Protocol. And we need to start implementing. And implementation needs to be that we look at what it says and what it expected of us. And in the 1930 convention, it talks about immediate. And I don't call 95 years pretty immediate. And in the 1957 convention, it used the term immediate. And in the SDGs, when it comes to human trafficking in 2015, when they were launched, it uses the term immediate. So here we are a long time on. And the Palermo Protocol, which is 25 years old. So what I think we can do is start to highlight these policies, start to incorporate them into the thinking at the level of the G20 and talking at the level of the G20. What is it the G20 can do? And the relationship I formed with former Prime Minister from the UK, Gordon Brown, who was one of the architects of the G20, he talks about his progress in the G20 with the education of girls and leaving no girl behind, and the education of children. And his view was, unless you're talking at the language and the level that the G20 should be talking at, it may try and dupe you into doing something far less than is ambitious. And so that's why the thing that we're going to be talking about this afternoon, which is going to bring to the G20 a requirement where 50 million people, as I say, are exploited, 22,000 children die every year in forced labour. When we saw 2 aircraft crash, Boeing 737s, with the loss of about 400 lives, which was shocking, Boeing was grounded. The CEO was fired. There's a big investigation. But 22,000 children is 120 Boeings every year, and those are children dying in supply chains. So we need to up the game. And by doing something with the G20 and asking them to invest, as I say, 30 billion in their infrastructures so that we are seeing things happen. And one of the figures I will tell you is the global economy of crime generates 2.2 trillion. So that's more than over half of the G20 countries' GDP. And human trafficking is 10% of that. And yet globally, the investment by governments globally, not just G20, is less than 1.5 billion. So 30 billion is a small amount to actually start to protect the 50 million, protect 22,000 children every year from dying, and start to implement policies and processes that have been promised for 95 years. And that's what I think faith leaders and the Interfaith Forum, by us demanding it, spelling it out and giving them the solutions, but working with them. And I think this is one of the things that we can really lead on. It's 5 years, obviously, to 2030, so we're building up to it. But as we go into the next iteration of global targets, we need to say, let's keep this going, let's keep this moving. And of course, William Wilberforce, who was a British politician, he was a preacher. And he was laughed at when he talked about ending the transatlantic slave trade. I don't think we look back on history as him as a comedian. I think we look at him as somebody who really changed the world. He was one member of parliament in the United Kingdom and somebody who got partners who were also of faith. Well, we can do that. And as we heard Mary Robinson say yesterday, as Nelson Mandela said, it's only difficult until it's done.
Could I respond as well?
Yes, please.
I think one of the most energizing points that has come out of this, and I'm very thankful for Mustafa and for our friend who provoked us with 5 provocations, is this idea that we've been thinking about recommending policy to the G20, but the idea that policy is in place and it is not being enforced, and it takes the moral courage to be able to hold people accountable to that. That is a role that I'm just energized by as I sit here on the panel today, and something that I feel like we can all walk out of here. This is not a general audience. You are not general population. You have tremendous resources, tremendous skills, and a tremendous voice. And I think if all of us would take that moral courage and ignore the convenience that in our lives that comes, because of that, I think we could do much more to enforce policy than we have in the past. So I thank you for these ideas.
Thank you. Ibrahim.
If I can say 2 quick things. The one thing is that we can do with the G20 is to say that every crisis that we are all confronting are transnational crises. But we have inherited an international architecture that from World War II, where the World Bank, IMF negotiates between nations, we negotiate health policy between nations, we negotiate treaties between nations, so we have inherited an international governance system, whereas what the world truly needs, not in name, but in architecture, is a global governance system, because it is that helps us to manage COVID-19 and other pandemics that will come. Child trafficking, wars, and all of those kind of things. So I think that's the fundamental change, and it is unjust that a continent like Africa, a whole continent, is not in the United Nations Security Council, is a junior partner in the United Nations, and a recipient of aid in the World Bank system. And I think that's the architecture that must change, and certainly those of us who are in BRICS and in the G20 need to be the wheel within the wheel. And I think faith communities must give a moral voice to a fundamental, immediate shift in the architecture that governs the world.
Bunny?
Thank you.
May I?
Yes.
So since we started a little bit later, we can go over 5 minutes.
Thank you.
Okay, so that we can get questions from the audience.
Yes.
And then we'll have a break at 10 to 4. Or we'll have 10 minutes for the questions. And then I would appreciate if you could come back to the concurrent sessions at 4:15. Então, nós teremos agora 10 minutos de perguntas de vocês, e aí teremos o intervalo. E aí eu pediria gentilmente que vocês pudessem retornar às sessões plenárias paralelas pontualmente às 4:15. E, Bunny, posso fazer uma colocação? May I make it's not a question, but it's related to this wonderful panel. And we heard here you speaking about federal government and actions and the G20 nations and BRICS. And in previous plenary sessions, Elder Soares, I think, talked about how religious groups can initiate, and then reach the government. I just wanted to share really fast, and it's just because of what you brought here. And I was in government for a period as a state secretary for social welfare, and we have refugees from Venezuela, and the federal government wanted the states to receive these refugees. My state didn't want to receive refugees, the public opinion. And even some people that were in my staff, that were public servants, they were not in favor. And my heart was broken. I knew what needed to be done. So 2 religious communities, Latter-day Saints and evangelical and faith, they joined together. They initiated a contact, and they came to me, and they said that they would be bringing by themselves maybe 300 of Venezuelans. So that was an opportunity that I needed to join them and to partner with them and to help them. And so we institutionalized that because of 2 religion organizations. And then the civil society, after some months, saw that they were hardworking, good people, and then they started supporting it. It's just to show that you have the power.
The power of religion, yes, and especially when we work together and collaborate. Thank you so much. Isabella, you had your hand up.
Yes.
But is it okay if I turn to the audience and then you can have a response part of that? There's a gentleman at the back and one in front here, and Sheikh Letom. and that lady. Okay.
Hello, this is Dr. Mohammed Abu Hilal. I want actually to criticize the saying, no one left behind. And I think life is working in systems. And when you work in systems, there's some paradox. So when you say no one left behind, and you are not able to achieve this ambition, a lot of people will be left behind. And I think we need to change it with the saying, the best to the most. Because when you say no one left behind, everybody will interpret this in his way. And the result is the most vulnerable left behind. But when we say the best to the most, then it mandates that we need to discuss what is the best and who are the most that we need to serve. So this is my opinion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Okay, Medlir Mema, I'm a professor of national security international law at BYU, Idaho, and a researcher in Brussels on AI and global governance. And I want to talk about AI for a second, rather ask all of you about this, because we've heard a lot over the last 2 days about values, tradition, vision, a lot of very,
lofty,
high value kind of talk, but very little about the challenge and the opportunity that's right in front of our eyes, which is emerging technologies and artificial intelligence. I know there's a session about this later today, but I am a little bit concerned about the lack of seriousness of engaging with that particular topic. And so, first of all, I know Mr. Highland, the State Department just released an actual report on human trafficking and actually the impact of AI on that specifically. So if you could speak a little bit about that, if it's possible at all. Second, Sister Eubanks, if you can talk about, when I was looking at LDS Charities, there are a lot of priorities, a lot of them have to do with children. Technology is not one of those. And yet when it comes to in September, the UN Summit of the Future is actually coming up with a digital compact for the future, and emerging technology is part of that aspect of it. And I don't know how any of us here think we can achieve what we want to achieve without actually embracing what is in front of us and what's coming our way. And then for everybody else, if you want to respond, what are you doing specifically in your organizations to deal with this question of AI and emerging technologies more generally? Thank you.
Thank you. The lady there and then
thank you. This is a question for the UNHCR representative. On the Global Compact for Refugees, when it talks about the multiple stakeholders approach, it mentions specifically the faith-based organization, specifically several times. Can you give us some examples on how the faith-based organization have been useful in the fulfillment of UNHCR mission, besides the Romana example, of course? Thank you.
Thank you. There's a gentleman here, and then Sheikh Latom, and that'll be the last.
Olá, meu nome é Roberto. Prazer muito grande estar aqui. Eu confesso que até umas 2, 3 horas atrás estava muito agoniado, né, porque eu vejo que é uma espécie de uma cooperação, uma tentativa de cooperação, de efetivar uma cooperação. Mas eu acho que a gente precisa avançar muito mais. Nós precisamos estruturar uma coalizão. Nós representamos, coordenamos uma confederação com 7.000 organizações ativas, ONGs, né? Aqui nós chamamos de OCIPs, OSCs. E aí a pergunta que eu faço é a seguinte: no contexto da economia solidária, que é o que nós precisamos exercitar, a economia social solidária, o que nós poderíamos fazer em termos de uma coalizão, já que o governo não consegue dar conta, tomar conta e dar conta de tantos e tantos desafios? Não é? E nós temos pressa, o planeta tem pressa, os seus seres têm pressa. e nós não temos muito mais tempo. Então, eu pergunto, que tipo de coalizão nós podemos construir, né, junto com todas as tradições religiosas proativas, porque eu estou entendendo que todas que estão aqui são proativas, não é? Poderíamos fazer em termos de uma coalizão para exatamente trabalhar com o terceiro setor da economia, não é? Com as ONGs, né? Como nós poderíamos complementar as políticas públicas, mas dentro de uma coalizão a partir do terceiro setor, que as igrejas também, todas, fazem parte do terceiro setor. E mais uma coisa, não é só uma coalizão por uma coalizão, é também uma coalizão ancorada no espiritual, que eu acho que o diferencial de tudo, de estarmos junto com todas as igrejas, independentemente das suas tradições, é exatamente o contexto espiritual. Como é que a gente ancora essa coalizão no espiritual?
Thank you. The lady in the green and then Sheikh Lato. Quickly, please.
I just wanted to ask if there could be a possibility to focus on short, medium, and long-term action steps, and how we could propose this to the G20 states to mitigate and reverse environmental degradation, in terms of anything related to those that are the most vulnerable that we talked about. So then there would be a list, even if repetitively being mentioned. But I think that we should really focus on the policy making, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation over and over and over again until the recommendations are actually put in place, and including technology, as our colleague has mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman here, Sheikh Lato. If you could make it short.
I sympathize with you, Bani. I know you're pressed for time, but very quickly, my brother there, Brother Ibrahim Rasool, you provoked us, and rightly so. That reminds me, some years ago, my sister, Dr. Husna, took me to the UK, all the way from London to Birmingham, to attend a debate where the discussion was very interesting. Is religion an asset or a liability in humanitarian work? I found that to be a little bit shocking, but then I understood why. One is because those of us who are within religion, when it comes to humanitarian work, taking care of the vulnerable, we have misrepresented religion. Again, for those who are outside religion, they have misunderstood religion. So what we need to do, the people who represent religion should properly represent religion, because if religion is not humanitarian, if religion does not take care of the most vulnerable, I don't know what else religion should do. When I look at the teachings of religion, it's about taking care of the most vulnerable. So we just need to present religion correctly, and those outside make some efforts to understand the role of religion. Finally, my brother Rasool, I agree with you totally. We need to be brave enough and embrace the theology of, I don't want to call it confrontation, but telling the truth to the tyrant, because the Prophet ﷺ said the best jihad is to tell the truth to the tyrant ruler. That is what we should do.
Thank you very much. So, to my dear panelists, my apologies. You have 1 minute each to answer those questions and give your wrap-up comments. So I'll start with Isabella, and maybe I'll give you 1 minute and 10 seconds, because I took away time from you.
Thank you. Eu vou responder então a pergunta e como foi falado na pergunta, o Pacto Global para Refugiados reconhece o papel essencial das instituições baseadas na fé nesse papel de assistência dos refugiados, dando suporte humanitário para as pessoas na prevenção de conflitos, reconciliação e muitas vezes reconstrução e paz. Então, também fazendo um vínculo de como, então, essas instituições ajudam o Acnur, né, o Alto Comissariado da ONU, a implementar esse mandato de proteção. Eu acho que, desde esse ponto mais de assistência direta às pessoas, que eu vou até compartilhar aqui a experiência do Brasil, é o que a gente vê no Brasil inteiro, uma rede enorme de instituições que dão um apoio, mas também, e fazendo já um link ao comentário de vocês com relação ao G20, nessa busca de implementação, né, de cobrar pela implementação dos tratados internacionais, das obrigações dos Estados. E, por exemplo, aqui no Brasil, a sociedade civil, por meio da Caritas e de uma instituição da irmã Rosita, muito conhecida no meio, eles têm um papel no Comitê Nacional de Refugiados, onde eles fazem esse papel diariamente de enforcement, de implementação, de busca de garantir que o direito de proteção seja implementado no dia a dia.
Thank you. So we'll come this way and then Ibrahim Rasool gets the last word, no?
Oh, okay.
The gentleman next to you.
Thank you. So very briefly, I'll just make a comment on the idea of leaving, changing the word to most. That then becomes very subjective. Who decides what is the most? Who do we leave behind and who don't we want? And our faith, we all try to aspire to live our faith. How many of us actually achieve it? Do we dilute our faith because we don't achieve it? We don't. So we have to set standards high. On the particular subject about AI, on the tactical elements of what I'm talking about to deliver to the G20 and the structure that should come out of that, one of the real areas is technology. AI as a tool to assist in preventing human trafficking, and AI as a tool that is being used, as in the Trafficking in Persons report, where it talks very much about the crimes where people are trafficked to do frauds elsewhere in the world. So it is something that we have to include in the conversation with a number of other areas as well, like business supply chains. And I think that's what we need to do. We need to understand how trafficking happens, understand where the intervention points are, what legislation and what protocols and rules are already there, but let's move to implementation.
Thank you.
I would just say, in response to the Sheikh's question about having the ability to tell truth to the tenant power, I think AI gives us new opportunities to reach people in isolation where they have been before. I think that's a great opportunity. I like the ideas of small, medium, long-term goals. And I think maybe from Mustafa's presentation, the lowest hanging fruit is children, because they are completely innocent in this situation they have been born into. And so I'd like to think about ways that we might use these tools in behalf of that low-hanging fruit.
Thank you. Mustafa Nelson.
Thank you, Bani. My last point, and that is, I'll just pick it up from what Sheikh Lithome said. We must have the courage to tell truth to power, and it is our responsibility, it's your responsibility to do that. If you don't do that, then you are lacking in moral courage. Faith leaders must provide the moral compass to address these challenges that we've been discussing in this panel. If we don't do that, the children will never forgive us. They're gonna knock on our doors. They are calling, and we will have no answers. They are going to find the answers, and we may not like the answers that they are going to give us. Thank you.
Only to thank you and to say that we are more powerful than we have been, and we have to use more our hands than our heart.
Thank you very much. Just very quickly, I think the idea of building coalitions is a very important one. In South Africa, the formula was very simple. When you share values, you form alliances for the long term. Where you share objectives, you form coalitions for the medium term. Where you share projects, you form fronts and partnerships for the immediate term. And the problem with the solidarity social sector, the third sector, is that sometimes they are so focused on one issue that they are unable to see the big picture. And they do excellent work on their one issue. What we need is a combination of those who mop up the problems and those who close the tap. Because if we all just mop, no one closes the tap. And the invitation must be that when we do our work with children, we do it well and we mop well. But we also focus on closing the tap, the structural tap that keeps on leaving people behind. And then finally, Sheikh Ibrahim, the issue of a focus on humanitarianism is what Gandhi discovered when he was invited to South Africa to deal with land confiscation of black people. He then realized that if the law itself was unjust, the best lawyer could not win in court. And that was the very fun. That's how South Africa changed a lawyer to a Mahatma.
Thank you. Thank you very much to a wonderful panel. Thank you to this amazing audience. Sorry we didn't have more time for a discussion. But the good news is we get to go to break and then come back here at 4:15. Thank you.
Então, lembrem, é um intervalo de 15 minutos. Nós retomamos as sessões plenárias paralelas às 4h15.